I'm Becky Quick of CNBC and your host of The Forum. I'll be guiding you through exclusive conversations among some of the world's global leaders. Conversations previously held behind club doors, but today we invite you in. The Economic Club of New York serves as the premier forum for nonpartisan discussion dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds with preeminent public and private sector leaders. A nonprofit 501c3, the club is a 115-year-old platform for the conversations that help shape the future of our world. The Economic Club of New York, brightest minds, critical conversations, catalyst for innovation.
The administration has struck a trade relationship / some type of deal with the United Kingdom. It's the first deal, much awaited, that people have been really kind of promised would be coming. So I want to begin. John, give me your sense of whether this is an earth-shattering deal.
I don't think so. It still sounds like more of a framework. So that's some progress, but it also includes things that have been under discussion between the US and the UK for many years. I think that for people at the level of the firm, agreements in principle or framework agreements don't tell them the answer to the question they need, which is how much do I have to pay on which widgets from which countries? And that still remains a long way away. And I think it also highlights the uncertainty about this whole tariff exercise, because the longer the negotiations take, the more specific they are. I've never wanted to be a trade lawyer or a trade negotiator. I'd much rather negotiate simpler things like strategic nuclear weapons, arms control. It's going to take time, and it's going to lead, I think, to continued volatility in the economy.
Just to be clear, we have an actual trade balance with the United Kingdom. So could this be perceived as a little bit of a, is there any there? Where's the big one with the European Union or China?
Well, let me back up one step from that. I think this tariff program is a form of economic illiteracy. I think it's going to be badly damaging to the economy of the United States. I don't have any problem in going after the really bad actor in international trade, which is China. Although normally, if you want to go after somebody like that, you'd think the first step would be to get your friends and allies on your side to join with you, rather than going to war with the whole world in the trade world. So I think we're in a very problematic situation. And I just make one other point here that goes beyond the economic. If you talk to people in Europe and Asia, really around the world, and say, well, what's your reaction to Liberation Day and all of the other tariffs we've been talking about? The reaction you get is that people are just dumbfounded with what we're doing. And I am very much afraid that, combined with some other things, I am worried that we are ripping through decades of effort, build up trust, good faith, reliance on the United States, on our leadership, which is important for our national security. I don't know how much more damage will be done as this trade policy works its way out. I do think we can correct the damage, but nobody should underestimate how bad it is. I'm worried our friends overseas will react more strongly than they should. I think, for example, Chancellor Merz's statement, new Chancellor of Germany, that he wants independence from the United States is the kind of statement that just makes things worse. But this breaking of intangible, non-quantifiable bonds between us and our best allies, I'm very worried about the long-term consequences. Folks should understand Trump sees international affairs through the prism of his personal relationships with foreign leaders. So if he has a good personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, if they're friends, as Trump thinks they are, then the United States and Russia have good relations. It's very hard to predict how these relations go, but dignity and a little patience, I think, goes a long way.
Back in April 2018, you were the one who urged President Trump to exit the Iran nuclear deal, which about a month later, he did. Since then, Iran has continued to basically break every rule of that deal. But last year, the UN nuclear watchdog that gets to go in and inspect Iran's nuclear enrichment program said that it felt that it had enough. Iran has enough, and this was a year ago, to make at least 2 nuclear weapons. So here we are today. Do you think Iran has nukes?
I don't think they have them yet, but I think they could get them pretty quickly. I think that's why Israel feels particular time pressure now to do something about it. And the only viable way to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat, the threat of proliferation that would affect the whole region, is to destroy the program. I think that the idea that the Iranian leadership has any idea whatever of actually giving up its nuclear program is a complete misconception. I think they've been badly damaged by Israel, by the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the pounding their terrorist proxy groups have taken, and the pounding they've taken in Iran when Israel destroyed their ballistic missile production capabilities. So they'd love to have a long negotiation that drags time out. Time is always on the side of the proliferator, and maybe get some more replacements from Russia for the S-300 air defenses that Israel's destroyed, and put themselves back in business. I don't think we should waste any time. This nuclear program is not Israel's problem, really. It's America's problem. We alone kept our eye on what's wrong with nuclear proliferation, and we alone can stop it. So I think with Israel, or let Israel go on its own, this is the time to act.
One of the proxies that Iran funds is the Houthis in Yemen. So the Houthis have been attacking American warships in the Red Sea. They've been lobbing all kinds of bombs at Israel constantly. Do you think the Houthis are done? They've put their munitions down?
I wouldn't trust the Houthis as far as I could throw them. And Trump himself said in the Oval Office, I trust the Houthis. Now, let me just say, I don't trust the Houthis. He said this was always only a freedom of navigation operation for the United States to clear the Red Sea, Suez Canal maritime passage. That's true. And freedom of the seas has been a principle of American foreign policy since before we were a country. You know, one of our first overseas operations was fighting the Barbary pirates, not far away. For those who say we should avoid all these foreign entanglements, it's what Thomas Jefferson did to protect American commerce in the early 1800s. But it left Israel. The Houthis would not have two rocks to rub together if they weren't supplied by the Iranians, and who have also helped them develop their own indigenous manufacturing capability. The Houthis are part of the Iran problem, just like Hamas is, just like Hezbollah is, just like the Assad regime was, just like the Shia militia in Iraq are. It all stems to the Iranian effort to draw what they themselves call the ring of fire around Israel, but also around the Gulf Arab states, and ultimately to threaten us.
Okay, that said, as we look at what Iran is doing, you have to wonder what can be done. Now, President Trump has said he wants to open the lines of communication. He said that back in the first administration, and in your book, you said that you and Mike Pompeo and Benjamin Netanyahu kind of worked together to make that not happen. Do you not feel that it is better, even with enemies, to at least start talking?
Well, I think you have to have some belief that the talking will lead to something productive. And the behavior of the Iranians over the last 30 years indicates they made a strategic decision to get nuclear weapons, and they have never given it up. The history of negotiations, both with Iran and with North Korea, have shown over and over again that the proliferators are willing to commit to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for tangible economic benefits. And the way it always works out is they get the tangible economic benefits at the front end of the implementation of the deal, but somehow they never get around to destroying their nuclear weapons program. How interesting is that? And that's what the Iranians are now trying to do in the negotiations with Steve Witkoff. I have a feeling this Houthi arrangement has something to do with the Iranian nuclear negotiations. As I say, the Houthis are dependent on their weapons supply chain from Iran, and I think there's something there we still don't know about. It's not good news. Look, for Israel, they face the immediate threat. It is existential. Now deceased Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon really got George W. Bush's attention on this point when he said that Israel faced the threat of a nuclear holocaust from Iran. And that's what's on the mind of Israeli decision makers, and why they see time pressure right now. They don't want to wait to find out that Iran has crossed the finish line. They want to deal with the problem before that existential threat is created.
Would you like to be a part of the conversations at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org.
I'm surprised at what you said, where you said, I really enjoyed my time at the United Nations. You have said in the past that if 10 stories were lopped off the top of the UN Secretariat building, nobody would notice and it wouldn't make a bit of difference. Listen, the United Nations has been anti-Semitic from day one. And all of this, by the way, does have an economic piece to it because black swans come in many forms. So the attack October 7th was a horrific situation, not to mention the fact that, 2022, the United Nations had something like 160 sanctions against Israel and just 68 against every other country in the world. And mind you, this was happening at the same time that Russia had invaded Ukraine. And, there are a whole bunch of other things. I mean, Syria dropping chemical weapons on its own people. And yet they keep going after Israel. So why did you enjoy your time at the United Nations?
Because there was so much damage control to do. Back
a lot of work.
Back in the George H.W. Bush administration, I had been in charge of UN affairs at the State Department working for Jim Baker. And one of the things we did then, President Bush and Secretary Baker led, was the repeal of the UN General Assembly's 1975 resolution that equated Zionism with racism. And I thought, well, once we got that repealed, the problem of anti-Semitism at the UN would disappear. Don't call me naive too often, but that obviously turned out not to be correct. The UN has a lot of specialized agencies, many of which do good work, like the IAEA, but the principal political decision-making bodies, the Security Council, the General Assembly, Human Rights Council, are fundamentally broken and are not going to be fixed. So there's a lot of UN reform that could be done. I would change fundamentally the funding system. I would abolish assessed contributions where the U.S. pays 22% of whatever they do. I'd make all contributions voluntary. I think that would be like a tsunami through the UN system. I think the Trump administration is looking at that. I'm sorry, Elise Stefanik didn't get confirmed. I hope Mike Waltz does. There's a lot more reform to do, quote unquote.
Back in 2002, I remember that you said that in addition to the original three countries of the axis of evil, which would be North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, it should include Cuba, Syria, and Libya. That was 2002. Today, would you kick out any of those names as part of the axis of evil, and whom would you replace them with?
Well, Libya's collapsed. It has split between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, with a theoretical government in Tripoli and General Haftar in charge of the eastern part. So they're not as bad as under Gaddafi. They're just in a state of anarchy. In Syria, the Assad regime is gone. That is a plus because that's a big hit to Iran. This new regime says it has renounced terrorism. Color me skeptical at this point. I don't see it. If I were going to add countries, I'd add Venezuela and Nicaragua. I thought the biggest failure, my own sort of biggest failure when I served as National Security Advisor, was not helping the Venezuelan opposition overthrow the Chavez, now Maduro regime. It's terrible for the people, and it's a way for China and Russia to get inroads into this hemisphere.
Didn't they get close, though?
It was very close. I can just tell you that the opposition put its plan in motion. I remember at about 5 o'clock that morning, I thought, this is really going to happen. And probably due to Cuban infiltration of the opposition, it didn't. It was a sad day for Venezuela and a sad day for us.
Let's bring it stateside. Law firms. President Trump has been attacking law firms, and he launched executive orders that target specific law firms across the country that he perceived had supported his enemies and worked against him. And therefore, he said, you know what, we're going to investigate you and we will potentially sanction you. 9 of the law firms shortly thereafter bent. And they basically said, we're entering a deal to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in pro bono work in return for the executive orders being revoked. Something like 125 million apiece, pro bono free work. But I would imagine that's only for issues that the president agrees with. 2 of those law firms, Covington and Kirkland Ellis, you worked for when you were in the private sector. So the question is, how do you read that? what are the dangers, if you see any at all, of law firms engaging in this kind of deal? And would you, if you were running one of them, have agreed?
Well, I think it's shameful on the part of the president to press these deals to begin with, and shameful to enter into them. Every law firm that's challenged these executive orders in court has prevailed because they're grotesque violations of the First Amendment. And it's, this is a way of extending executive power into the private sector that's almost hard to imagine its effects. I hope that the firms that have signed these agreements find a way to interpret them in a way that doesn't give Trump what he wants. But the heroes are the firms that said, we're not going to accept this. We're going to fight for our rights. And they were vindicated. You'd think some of the firms that have signed up would say, I'll take that too.
Yeah, but it's pretty surprising. Paul Weiss, Kirkland Ellis, so many of these august law firms.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm a former litigator, back when I was, to see your own lawyers agree that quickly to give up $125 million worth of billable hours is not somebody I'd like to see litigating or trying to settle a case for me.
That actually leads back to Congress. Are you surprised that we, even after the recess, where a lot of these guys went home, they listened to their constituents about rising prices, and they came back and still nobody but Rand Paul and maybe a couple of others kind of quietly said something? At what point do you think, if ever, they will start saying this has got to end?
Well, a couple have, even before the recess. Ted Cruz, I think, spoke out against the tariffs. I'd like to see a lot more Republicans stand up. These, if you went back 20 or 30 years and got remarks that Dick Gephardt, Democratic leader of the House, had made on the subject of tariffs, it would sound very familiar. It's the rhetoric that's coming from the White House. Of course, the Democrats and the labor unions like tariffs. This is not Republican policy. I do think it's going to begin because I think the negative consequences of the tariffs will have political impact. And it won't be felt by the president, who I think is not running for a third term and constitutionally can't. So the political guardrail that existed in the first term on him is gone. But for Republican members of the House, all of them, and a third in the Senate, they could face consequences. And for them, that famous chart that the president held up on Liberation Day, I mean, in political terms, that could go down as one of the strangest suicide notes in history if Republicans are not careful. So better to say now, I'm a little concerned about the economic impacts here. I think that's what they heard from their constituents over the recess. I hope they're at least telling the White House this is bad news. And I think that could have pushed this British deal to the fore so they could announce they had done something.
And that leads to at least some Republican-run states, headed states, actually speaking out about continuing funding the Ukraine fighting back against the invasion by Russia. That surprised me from an economic standpoint, that we haven't heard more of these red states. And quite frankly, we know blue states have been pushing for it, but they're the ones who benefit from the manufacturing of the munitions, of the weapons that are going right to Ukraine.
Yeah. Look, one of the things that we need substantial increases in defense budgets for is to rebuild industrial capacity in the weapons area. We have all fallen prey to what people said when the Soviet Union collapsed. Remember, people were saying it was the end of history. We had a peace dividend. We could cut defense spending. It was a mistake then. We've paid for it a long time, and we're now going to have to spend to get it back. I agree with Trump that the defense spending of NATO members should be 5% of GDP, if not more. That's a Reagan-era level. If you want to get the deficit down, that means cutting domestic spending more. I'm fine with that. It's hard to do politically, but I think if we don't start doing that, we're going to pay the price down the road. And you don't want to turn the support for Ukraine purely into an economic calculation.
Of course.
But the money that we've spent there has decimated the Russian army. Lloyd Austin, former defense secretary, said the Russians, this is said 2 years ago, the Russians are feeding their army into a wood chipper. That is something it's going to take Putin a long time to build back up. The Ukrainians, pretty much on their own, have put most of Russia's Black Sea fleet on the floor of the Black Sea, which is a very fine place for it to be in terms of Black Sea security. The Ukrainians, of necessity, on the battlefield, have developed more in drone technology than the cumbersome American defense procurement system could have done in years. And I hope, while we're taking their minerals in the mineral deal, they'll be kind enough to help us with drone technology too. I mean, this is real-time research and development they need to do. So I'm not saying you judge the war on that basis. It's a question of defeating unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe, where we said after 1945 we'd never permit it to happen again. But there's a lot that we're getting out of this that nobody has explained to the American people. I mean, I think the American people are not isolationists like some believe, but I think politicians have got to explain to the people what the benefit of a strong, forward American national security policy is. We knew how to do that in the Cold War, but since the fall of the Berlin Wall, our politicians as a class have forgotten how to do it.
From where you have sat in many different roles and how you look at the world, who is the most dangerous to American democracy, the biggest threat? Is it Vladimir Putin? Is it Xi Jinping? Or is it fill in the blank?
Well, I think the Chinese Communist Party, I think the threat from China is the biggest threat we're going to face in the 21st century. And I think the manifestation of that worries me most is the axis that China is forming with Russia. Today in Moscow at their VE parade, Xi Jinping is the honored guest, and that's not accidental. So when you look at the war in Ukraine, when you look at the war in the Middle East, when you look at China's threat to Taiwan, the South China Sea, and as you mentioned, along the line of actual control within, these threats are not disconnected. They're not disconnected. China has given material assistance to Russia in the Ukraine conflict. It's bought significantly greater quantities of oil and gas from Russia. It's laundered sanctioned Russian financial assets through China's opaque financial system out into the world markets, and it'll expect the same from Russia. This is a growing problem for us. I think our friends in Europe need to understand that. It's one strengthening the NATO alliance is so important, and going beyond that, I have recommended that we follow former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar's suggestion to make NATO global, admit Japan, Australia, Singapore, Israel. I think this Beijing-Moscow axis is a global threat, and I think it requires a global response.
Do you count North Korea in there? You've got tens of thousands of North Koreans fighting in Russia and Ukraine.
It's a very important point. The axis has its outriders already. North Korea is one, Iran's another, Syria before Assad fell was another, Belarus in this hemisphere, the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They are growing closer, and I think the threat's growing. This is among the reasons why an American retreat from the world and the neo-isolationism that we see expressed openly by some Republicans in particular is very disturbing, because whatever order and stability there is in the world, and there's not as much as they should be since 1945, frankly, has fundamentally come from the United States and its power and its influence and its allies. And if we step aside, one of two things happens. Either chaos fills the void or one of our adversaries fills the void. Now, our system benefits a lot of people around the world who don't shoulder up, bear their fair share. But I think our political leaders have to make clear to the American people, we're not doing this around the world because of eleemosynary motivations or because we're nice people, although we are. We're doing this for us. It benefits a lot of other people, but fundamentally it benefits us. And if we walk away from it, nobody else is going to do it for us.
Would you like to be a part of the conversations at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org.